Hi, this is Anne Filippi, founder of the New Health Club. If you want to know about psychedelics as new mental health tools, you came to the right place. I talk to innovators, thought leaders, and disruptors, creating the future of mental health and mental wellness. And we think that the future is already here.
The only reason that I became a religious person and the only reason that I became a rabbi is because I had had an experience with what we call expanded states of consciousness. When I was 15 years old, I was on a Israel trip. I was at an archaeological dig. I was raised Jewish. I had a bar mitzvah. We were part of the Jewish community, but spirituality or mysticism or, the soul, and any of these things were not part of the conversation. It was just our community and what we did, as much as we did.
Hi, and welcome to a new episode of the New Health Club show. We are back for a new season of podcasts, and I'm very happy about this and very excited. My guest today is Zac Kamenetz. Zac is a rabbi, community leader, and aspiring psychedelic chaplain based in Berkeley, California. He holds an MA in Biblical Literature and Languages from UC Berkeley and the Graduate Theological Union, and received his rabbinic ordination in 2012. He's also the founder of the Shefa Foundation for Psychedelic Therapy, grounded in Jewish spirituality. He was part of a psilocybin study that dosed clergy of various traditions with psilocybin, the psychoactive compound found in psychedelic mushrooms, and psilocybin mushrooms to be precise. This conversation is not only exploring the new territory between psychedelics and religion, in his case, Judaism. Zac and I talk the future of psychedelic therapy, and in Zac's case, that could mean, is there a Jewish psychedelic therapy with a Jewish set and setting? And that's something that Zac is very interested in. We talk epigenetic trauma and experiences, the new openness towards religions and psychedelics, and why there might be the New Health Club Shul one day in Germany. But now please enjoy Zac and the show. Welcome, Zac Kamenetz, to the New Health Club podcast. I'm very excited about this because it's really such a new topic that we will address in the next hour. I don't think most people have ever heard of it. So, and besides that, you're a rabbi, which you are, right? I mean, you're a proper rabbi. We can talk about that later, a proper rabbi. So I would say that you are probably the first kind of, at the moment, most discussed rabbi who would actually work on bringing psychedelics back into Judaism or into the Jewish religion. I mean, Judaism is like maybe the bigger picture. But let's say the new emerging Jewish psychedelic renaissance. This is your topic, right? I mean, yes. One could say that. So, of course, how did this all start, and how did you get into the whole new science of psychedelics?
Well, I think psychedelics have been part of everybody's life in one way or the other. When I was a kid, I was receiving messages in Southern California, where I grew up, about not taking LSD, or there are stickers out there that have LSD that will kill you or scramble your brain. Or when I grew up, that ecstasy will change your DNA forever and I'll never be able to have children. Or mushrooms will turn you into a cup of orange juice in your brain and you'll be in a hospital thinking that you can never sit down because then you'll spill over. So I was frightened to death about drug use. Mm-hmm. And I stayed away from it, and it never came up. There was never an opportunity to take psychedelics. And I was okay with that. And one day someone forwarded me an email that they were looking, a study, a proper laboratory study was looking for subjects to take psilocybin in a research environment, a safe and supported research environment. And because I had never taken psychedelics before, I was naive, that I was accepted into the program. And that was the first time I had ever really made contact with it. And those sessions that I had in that environment were so profound and powerful, that not only did they have important and lasting effects on my own life and the way that I think about my life, but I'm naturally curious. I started doing all of this reading about the history of the first wave of indigenous and native use, the second wave of psychedelic research in this country and in Europe, and then started understanding that my participation in this study was part of what people are calling the third wave. And I really became very interested, concerned, excited, nervous that if psychedelic therapy and whatever lies beyond therapy is going to be made available in the next years, what will be the impact on religion, religious people, theology, religious ritual? And I just did not hear voices helping me figure that out. And so I kind of took a leap and said, I guess I have to start this conversation out loud, and maybe not start the conversation. There are many other people having it, but bringing more voices together into a community, right? To start having a public conversation versus people doing it in private or individually.
Okay. So, and then you took part in the study you were explaining, right? And I mean,
yeah,
I think as far as I understand, it's a study that was also for people with, let's say, religious, like clergy, you could say.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess that there were also like Catholic priests maybe involved.
I imagine so. I imagine religious leaders of all stripes.
Yeah. So, and I mean, as we know now from Brian Waresku's book, which focuses a little bit on the Greek and Catholic culture, rituals that to kind of undertake rituals that would actually lead to religious practices that we know today, but we never know that maybe psychedelic experiences were involved. So, but of course, in Judaism, there's also a tradition of kind of spiritual experiences, as far as I know now, that are related also to maybe psychedelic experiences. So you undergoing this study, were you in touch before with let's say with the knowledge around this? Or was it something that you discovered, let's say, first of all, on a very private level? Because that's what a lot of people actually are saying about their psychedelic experiences, that it brings them back to a spiritual moment in their life, with or without belonging to a religion.
Yeah. Well, I think my story is mine, and so it's unique that way. The only reason that I became a religious person, and the only reason that I became a rabbi, is because I had had an experience with what we call expanded states of consciousness when I was 15 years old. I was on a Israel trip. I was at an archaeological dig. I was raised Jewish. I had a bar mitzvah. We were a part of the Jewish community, but spirituality or mysticism or, the soul, any of these things were not part of the conversation. It was just our community and what we did, as much as we did. But I had this unrehearsed, completely out of nowhere experience where I felt my mind open up. I felt contact with what I associated with the divine, with God, God's self. It was brief. It was powerful. It was life-changing. And the minute after that, I knew that I had to be an observant Jew. I started covering my head and keeping kosher and observing Shabbat, the Sabbath, because of this one unrehearsed moment. And so people talk about this with regard to psychedelics, that is like a repeatable and reliable way to access these states of consciousness. But there are, of course, many other ways to achieve these states. And some of them we don't ask for. And we have these stories all the time. Paul on the road to Damascus, right? He's on a horse and is blinded by a light and then has a new charge and has a completely new direction. We have spontaneous accounts of prophecy in the Hebrew Bible, right? People who we don't know anything about them until, boom, their minds or the sky opens up and they make contact with this commanding voice. And so when I became part of this research study, I had already had this moment in my life. So having psychedelics, I could actually compare it to what I had experienced prior to that. I don't know if someone hasn't had that kind of what we call endogenous, like the thing happening within you without something happening externally. I had an endogenous spiritual experience like this that changed the course of my life. And then I had one that I took a pill and had a different kind of experience. So I'm able to kind of balance them or compare them.
Okay. So, but I mean, you practice as a rabbi right now, right? I mean, one could actually, if I would be converting, I would have to knock on your door 12 times. So that's the job you're doing, right?
Yeah, so we love to talk, Jan. I love to talk.
I just noticed from Sex and the City, by the way, that you have to knock 12 times.
Is that what they say in Sex and the City?
When you want to convert.
I don't think, I think that might be a little bit of a dramatic effect. I think if someone asks 3 times, then you know that they're serious. You don't turn them away more than 3 times, but you should try to dissuade them. Okay.
So, and in what way did your, let's say, psilocybin experience change, let's say, your job or how you talk to people, how you maybe look at them in a different way? Because I think that's a thing that really happens after psychedelic experiences, that you become either like more compassionate with people, or you kind of engage with a certain kind of people you don't engage anymore with before there's even a conflict arising.
Maybe, these are non-specific amplifiers of the human psyche, as Stan Grof and others say. So, if you're a neo-Nazi and you take LSD, you might become a better neo-Nazi, right?
What does that mean exactly?
What is a better neo-Nazi? I mean, you'll have to ask them, but maybe your orientation, you are so convinced about, the purity of white ancestry, or the mission of white nationalism, or, of a white God, that there's no doubt in your mind anymore that this is the true path. So there's the possibility for whatever your orientation or your intention to be amplified. If you hope to be more compassionate, if you hope to be more peaceful, if you hope to be more spiritual, that might happen through your integration and meaning-making process, but it might not. People could also have terrible experiences, confusing, painful, and even if they're working with a therapist or they're working with a guide, they might not so easily be able to have it mean something beautiful or powerful. So just to kind of put that out there. But for me, in my experience, I had already been doing a lot of work with mindfulness, specifically with mindfulness-based stress reduction, and trying to use that as a platform to talk about big Jewish ideas, big Jewish questions, and practice for better living and for feeling at home in the universe. That was already my orientation. Mm-hmm. What I think taking psychedelics helped me clarify, I'm a lover of Jewish wisdom. I'm sitting in front of all of these books that you can see on the Zoom call. I love words. I love rabbis. I love thinkers. I love philosophers and poets. And I think that after taking psychedelics, what changed within me was, if I open up a book about Kabbalah, about the Jewish mystical path, or Chassidut, right? This ecstatic movement that happened in Eastern Europe, starting with the Baal Shem Tov and continuing today. The experiences that they have been speaking about and writing about, that I had read and loved, I felt a great amount of distance between what they were talking about and my ability to access them. It felt like dessert. It's like, okay, I'm a lover of texts. I read them for inspiration or values or for guidance or for messages, or I read about Jewish law and, how do I maximize my Sabbath Shabbat practice? How do I, keep kosher in a way that is an expression of my values, but never thinking about supernal realms and that I could actually access them, or that they could have an impact on my life in a real way. And having an experience with psychedelics, that those two moments, right? My first trip being beautiful, colorful, whatever full, it was full. And my second experience was darkness, emptiness, the void, and confusing. And to put those two together, to feel like, oh my God, there are at least these two brilliant poles of human experience that I have now within my memory and my body. And when I am reading these spiritual geniuses, that I can actually be able to live inside their words, that I could actually relate to the things that they're saying, even though it happened through psychedelic experience, and maybe probably for them it was not, right? They were just natural or trained mystics without any use of plant medicine. It becomes much more of an alive tradition for me.
Okay. What I thought about when you have been undertaken these two trips, and then you, like I said, come back to you being a rabbi. So how do you talk to people about this?
Yeah.
Or do you talk to people about this, or not at all? That come to you. Okay. Mm-hmm.
I definitely talk about, if people want to hear about my experience, I will talk to them about it for sure. What I want to communicate to more Jewish people, and maybe to all people, is that I think that there is something about Judaism that has always, for me, and I think for others, has had a missing piece, that we are presented mostly as young people, but also as converts or people who are married to Jews, right? That there are all of these exoteric trappings, right? We've got Shabbat, or we have keeping kosher, or we have, all of these rituals and all of these values and all of these good ideas. And, it's like a very pretty box of things, and it helps people find meaning in their lives. It's a wonderful thing. It's called a religion. But there is an aspect of Jewish religion that is ancient, that is really not part of people's consciousness. And that is that our practices, our rituals, the mind states that can be engendered through practice, the mystical aspect of our religion, the ability to see that there is a world beyond this one that we can see in our eyes. There is a world inside us that we can feel that is beyond our normal perception, that has in some ways been removed, either forcibly or complicitly. I think a lot of that has to do with Jews making contact with Christian neighbors that did not have a mystical orientation, and they wanted to become citizens of these nation states. So they allowed, these kind of more far out ways of being so that they can conform to their surroundings, which is completely understandable. We've also, and I know that this has been a focus of yours in the past, we have lost through pogroms and genocide and generations of violence, we have lost our spiritual ancestry in a lot of ways. Just great rabbis, great teachers, great students, natural mystics, men and women. And we have a remnant, a holy remnant, but a small sliver of the work the literature, the practices that have existed. And so I think now we are in recovery mode and need to do work to bring that back in. I think the loss of that mystical element is also part of intergenerational trauma.
Absolutely.
And I think that the healing that we can do, not only for our own traumas or our families or our families' families, is not only then just about violence or sexual trauma or all of these other things, displacement, but also to come back to that hot, burning, mystical core, which has animated Jewish religious experience since its inception.
Well, also, I mean, let's say here in Germany, if you would say what comes to mind when you think of Jews, I would assume that 80% would say, well, the Holocaust, like this is the topic. So, and this is exactly what you're saying. I totally agree, because I have to tell you, if I said this in the call with Adriana, but my first really big psilocybin experience was actually at Synthesis in Amsterdam. In the trip, I spent the whole time in Auschwitz with a rabbi walking around the camp. And he said to me, like, okay, you're not Jewish. And we like that. We're actually very happy you're not Jewish, because we need exactly somebody like you. And I'm just quoting the rabbi. I didn't make it up. He said to me, like, we need somebody like you to bring back the Jews to their old glamour, and that not everybody keeps thinking about those pajama pants from the camps.
Can you tell me what he looked like?
Yeah. He was very tall, a beard and blue eyes and super empathic. Like, to be precise, it was him and me being Tinkerbell, you know, the fairy from Peter Pan.
I understand.
So, and then he said to me, well, and if you help us to achieve this, we will help you with your business. And it was so interesting that it was a very clear communication, and in a way that, I mean, it's like, in let's say outside of a trip, you would never come up with an idea like that, right? And I think after this, I realized that how much kind of narratives around Judaism or Jewish culture is the Holocaust. And that's it, because Jews got killed in camps, and that's it. So, I mean, we're talking rather Germany now. And my perception is that because now psychedelics come in the game, this is actually a possibility to really show what Judaism really is, besides this tragic, horrible, I don't even know how to call it, actually. Is this something crazy that I'm saying?
First of all, I really appreciate you sharing that. And, you know, I want to give just some time and space to thinking about that rabbi with his blue eyes, you know, and who he is and who he was, you know, as your guide.
Yeah.
And I think that what you're pointing at, that, you know, Auschwitz and genocide has become the center of the conversation around Jews and Judaism for the past plus 70 years.
Yeah, exactly.
Or now about the state of Israel and Zionism.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not a new conversation. You know, in 2013, my teacher, Rabbi David Hartman, he wrote a really fundamental essay called Auschwitz or Sinai.
Oh, wow. I never heard of this. Interesting.
And, you know, in the light of renewed Jewish independence and sovereignty in the state of Israel, that he wanted to ask, you know, what will be the dominant narrative of the Jewish people moving into the 21st century? He says, one of the fundamental issues facing the new spirit of maturity in Israel is, should Auschwitz or Sinai, Mount Sinai, where the Jewish people were given the Torah, be the orienting category shaping our understanding of the rebirth of the state of Israel? You know, what he means is, are we going to build this state on trauma Or are we going to build this state on revelation? What mission are we going to carry out? And of course, I think it's not a surprise for people who know David Hartman that, the model of Sinai, he says, the model of Sinai awakens the Jewish people to the awesome responsibility of becoming a holy people. At Sinai, we discover the absolute demand of God. We discover who we are by what we do. Sinai calls us to action, to moral awakening, to living constantly with challenges of building a moral and just society which mirrors the kingdom of God in history. Woof!
Okay.
So in some ways, that's my mission as well. Like, it's the same but different, because I think as people who start to undergo these kinds of experiences, I think it's, of course, Auschwitz and Sinai. We have to take our suffering seriously. We have to take it seriously and actually find ways of healing. Not just either celebrating it as like, yes, here we are, here's our trauma. Isn't that fascinating? But take the work of healing and not just treating the symptoms in a serious way. To also continue to reach back to our foundational moment as a people, which is what David Hartman is talking about: moral awakening, discovering what it means to be a holy people, humility and openness to the demands of self-transcendence. I want a world that is built on both of them, but just like my 2 trips, the fullness and the light, the darkness and the void. We must take all of human existence together and build into the future that way, and not leave out some aspect of it.
I mean, there was this article about you called "Can Psychedelics Heal the Jewish People?" This rabbi is exploring the question. The headline is like, oh my God, that's a job. Like, do you know what I mean? It's like, where would you start with this? And at the same time, like, if I read the headline, I was like, what? But I mean, there's something beyond that they have to be healed. There are other things so it's not like just the whole healing, let's say a religion of people who need to be healed, because Catholics need to be healed too, to be honest.
Everyone.
In a different way. Yeah, everyone. But the Catholic religion is always kind of tailored around like, oh, you do something bad and you confess and then you're good, for example. And of course, you're not good, because this is just working in you. And it also, let's say, invites you to become a liar, because you would actually lie in the confession, which I did as a child, because I didn't want to get in trouble. So I lied to the priest, and all this kind of strange other psyche coming out of being Catholic. Mm-hmm. So you said also, like, what I found very interesting when you said your aim is to rekindling a type of fire that we haven't had in a long time in the Jewish religion. So can you talk a little bit about this fire, what you exactly mean by that?
I am inspired, like many others, by the work of Brother David Steindl-Rast, who is a monk and philosopher and writer. And he has a very important essay called "The Mystical Core of Organized Religion." And, many others have pointed this out, certainly in the history of religion, Rudolf Otto and Eliade and others, even Carl Jung, etc. But essentially that the point of inspiration for a religious movement happens out of a expanded state of consciousness, right? To move out of present reality into a larger picture, contact with absolute consciousness, contact with the divine voice, the divine presence. And that fiery moment where, as he says, you make contact with major concepts in an embodied way, like truth or goodness or beauty. I would even want to add, darkness, pain, suffering, right? He is only on the light side. I also want to include the dark side, like, your moment or like my moment. And through the encounter in such a vulnerable way, in such a real embodied way, that contact with those major ideas or major feelings, through our minds, we get things like doctrine, we get things like ethics, we get things like ritual to try to integrate, right? We've had these profound moments of insight, we had these profound moments of encounter, and we want to hold on to them in some way. We try to put language toward them. We try to create practices which anchor them in our everyday. So that happens, of course, in the individual level. That's like a model of psychedelic therapy. But I think he says, actually, that is how most religions are formed. We have someone like Moses and the people standing at the foot of or at the top of Mount Sinai. They see sounds, they hear colors, right? There's this synesthesia that happens. They hear the commanding voice of the divine, or they hear the silence of the divine in some interpretations. And from that moment, then Jewish religion is born. How do we continue to hear that voice or that silence every day? We put on these black boxes on our heads and on our arms to feel the divine presence, to wear Torah on our bodies. We keep Shabbat. We cease from creative action for 25 hours to live inside a divine reality of creativity and divine rest. And he says that over time, right, we only focus on those externalities. We only focus on those integration practices, and we forget the original experience of that core. And so what I'm hoping for is that more people will recognize, first of all, that they have encounters with expanded consciousness all the time, and they just don't name it that way, right? It's just Tuesday. But they are constantly going in and out of different states of consciousness, number one. Number two, that Judaism is a vehicle to reach those different kinds of states of consciousness. We have largely, I think, in whatever denomination, that we have focused a lot on either the ritual or the furniture or the synagogue, right? What's going to bring people in, or what's Jewish continuity, or what are Jewish values, and not thinking too much about the internal murmurings of the individual experience and how to awaken something deep within mind and heart and body. People are doing some good jobs at it, right? There's a lot of Jewish meditation that is happening right now. There's amazing music that is happening right now. There's just gatherings, at least before COVID, that were happening right now that were focused on that. But I think there's a fundamental block toward that is inside the ego, that is inside the individual mind, that there needs to be some release of the I, me, mine narrative that I think psychedelics can help us understand more, but it isn't required to do psychedelics in order to get there. And that's why, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Interesting. I kept thinking about this doctor in the 60s,
Yes.
Jan Bastians, the psychiatrist who helped survivors of camps with LSD therapy. And I mean, there are many articles about him now again, because this was probably the first person who actively focused on survivors. So, and now we have a little bit of I'm not going to say a new school, but Rachel Yehuda is actually working with this, and she was on a podcast too. So do you think that, let's say, if you're on the fast track to become a psychedelic rabbi, you're going to be maybe the most famous one very soon. So who knows? But I mean, I'm wondering, so do you think that this would be also something that a psychedelic rabbi would be able to address I'm not going to say in a better way, but in a very different way, if somebody comes in as a kind of third generation from a survivor family suffering from depression, which is often the case, as you know, through Dr. Yehuda's work. So do you see your work also in that context? And if so, like, how do you think about that right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I read Shiviti, A Vision, the book by Yechiel Denur, one of the most famous Jewish patient of Dr. Bastian's, he wrote an account of his treatment. The trip reports of him seeing visions of the throne of Adonai, of Yud-He Vav-He, of Yahweh, at the top of Auschwitz, right? Just to think about that for a moment, to think about the chariot of the divine floating over Auschwitz, right? He describes over the head of a guard, all right? That is a profound image. That's a profound image where he is able to experience it and write about it, but at least in his account in this book, Shiviti, A Vision, he is not able to relate it to his therapist, a non-Jewish, a Gentile, very good, decent person who is focused on healing. But I think that my interpretation of this is that there is a gap between therapist and patient. And I do wonder that if Denur was in the room with a rabbi who was, or a Jewish educator, or, a Jewish chaplain, who could be there not only as a physical and calming presence, but he could say, I saw the vision of Shiviti. I saw the vision of this very familiar image from Jewish culture, the lions and the name of the divine, and the throne and the crown. To be able to describe it without having to go into too much background detail, I think it would have been very different from him. Like for me, if I'm looking for a therapist, I'm looking for a Jewish therapist. I don't want to spend time having to dedicate okay, I'm going to teach you all about Shabbat right now, and then I'm going to tell you about how hard it is for some aspect of it. I want to skip over that. And I think what I'm learning from in the psychedelic world about issues with people of color, issues with LGBTQI plus people, right? That people are starting to talk about cultural specific care, and that people want to be able to think about their own community's needs and their own culture's needs in a very focused way. So I think that when I think about being a psychedelic rabbi, or when I think about being a Jewish psychedelic-assisted therapist for Jewish patients, I think that that's kind of the therapeutic alliance that I'm thinking about, is that we have this in common. We have this cultural ancestry that, if through intergenerational trauma, or just because of the archetypes that are passed through us, or childhood memories, that there isn't the time, that we don't need the time to explain what is the Torah, for example, or what it's like being in synagogue and being disinterested, or having a Jewish parent who is constantly angry because of their own trauma or wounding, in and through Judaism. And that we can then spend the time on the content of the experience itself. And the therapist or the chaplain is able to readily draw from our tradition in order to give these patients, these people who are looking for this experience, to make meaning in their life readily. So yes, we want to be helping Jewish people through Jewish tradition, addressing Jewish trauma. And we also, if there are therapists or guides who are not Jewish, we also want to be able to create and provide resources for them to be able to understand their patients better, what they're going through, their past, their history.
Okay. I had a similar topic with, do you know Dr. Monica Williams?
I don't.
She works also with MAPS, I think, and she's also a clinical psychiatrist and psychologist.
Yes,
and she works in terms of Black people, African American culture.
Mm-hmm.
And she even said that, let's say, if a Black person has a certain experience in their psychedelic experience that they undergo in terms of working on their depression, if there wouldn't be the right therapist who knows, let's say, the suffering of that person, the context of, let's say, a daily dose of racism, that even could lead at some point to harming the person undergoing the psychedelic experience, because they would not be understood in a moment that is maybe exactly the moment they need to go through, like you said. And it makes more and more sense to me that, that this is something in the next couple of years that this will become almost like impossible to ignore again.
Yes. And I think for Jewish people, at least I'll speak from my direct experience, and not for all Jewish people right now. Until I started doing this work and thinking about this and learning a lot from people who have been doing this for a very long time, never could have expressed some parts of my family history or narrative as trauma. The fact that I don't know my great-grandparents' names, the fact that I don't know where they came from, the fact that I have no traditions, that is a type of trauma. That is a type of being cut off from my own history, right? And that's not everybody's story. It's mine. That my family was in such dire financial situations coming from Europe and then settling in New York and then Southern California, that the past was a luxury, that they were hustling just to be able to live, that Judaism itself, the content of Judaism, which was too expensive to be Jewish.
Yeah. Wow.
To have just to have a synagogue membership, why do they need my money? And the skepticism, the pain of that, and just to be American and just to be able to survive, right? That was their focus. And thank God that they were able to do that. But, to be able to think about like, well, I have no history. I have no past. The traditions that I have in my life now are the traditions that I have created for myself from my community or from the books of dead people or, the ones that we've created on our own as a family. And I think that I would want to have something like a spiritual or cultural or ethnic based therapy in order to address those things in a real way and not to be convinced that those aren't real issues. Because that actually did happen to me in the study. Something that I was really wrestling with and wanted to address in my intention was my relationship to commandedness. Right? There's this idea in Jewish religion that there's this commanding voice, right? It's called chiyuv, obligation. Right? You're obligated to participate in Jewish law and Jewish ritual, right? It's not just like a good deed or a nice thing. It's like, oh, you're a citizen of Judaism. You abide by the laws, at least in some denominations. And I was really wrestling with this at that time. I wanted to help to reconnect to that aspect of my practice. And ever since I started talking about all of this publicly, a lot of people, Jewish people from around the world, have reached out to me to talk about their psychedelic experiences and are looking for advice. That's actually why I started the organization that I started.
Wow.
So, for example, I have got a lot of religious people who, after having some experience with psychedelics, either with a guide or on their own, but they have a powerful experience and then have a feeling like, well, why do I need to have a daily practice? Why do I need to be observant in the first place? What is the role of mitzvot, the commandments, in my life now at this point? Like, why do any of this? I don't want to have those people not have a voice that can understand in all of the depth and complexity to be their conversation partner. Ever since I started talking about my experiences more publicly and starting to talk about how important this is to really start focusing on, many people from around the world, Jewish people, have reached out to me to talk about their psychedelic experiences, either that they've had a guided experience or on their own. And just for example, when religious people, observant people, people who have the Torah and commandments as part of their daily life, often I hear, I had this profound experience. I had an encounter with God, or I just experienced my life and the world in a new way. Why should I follow the commandments anymore? Suddenly you've lived an observant life all of your life. It's your community. It's your daily practice. It's everything. And suddenly something happens in your mind. I want them to be able to have a rabbi or a Jewish chaplain or someone who understands all of the complexities and depth of what that means for them in their life. And I don't want to miss the opportunity for them to integrate that experience or that question as fully as possible, right? For me, it's not, oh, okay, well, you don't want to be observant anymore. Fine. So then try that out. Let's explore that. How long have you actually been feeling that way? What would that mean in real life? What about your observance has already been something that you have been wondering about exploring and your reasons why? I want people to feel held in a Jewish setting to be able to explore that, and to not just like have that be a thought and then to not follow up with it in a meaningful way. Mm-hmm. So that's why I have created this organization called Shefa, which is essentially Jewish psychedelic support. We offer integration circles for Jewish people that happen monthly, but will be expanding soon. We do advocacy and education with Jewish leadership and in Jewish communities about what is the psychedelic renaissance, what is Jewish therapy, what does Jewish psychedelics look like. And finally, we want to create these resources for Jewish therapists and therapists who aren't Jewish but are going to be treating Jewish patients in order to have them have some cultural competency with whatever might be coming up, either Holocaust trauma or displacement in North African and Arab countries, wounding from the religion itself, or any other trauma that might come up that people would associate with Judaism. And we want to eventually, in some ways, you're creating the new health club. We're thinking about what would the psychedelic synagogue actually look like if rabbis or chaplains had the ability to administer these therapies, either for people with diagnoses or that are well but are just looking for spiritual development. Yeah. What would a Jewish set and setting actually look like? How much intervention are we actually interested in? Is it enough